Hello everyone, we are going to be finishing our book, Who Was Walt Disney? We are on chapter 9, The Strike. Snow White made so much money that Roy and Walt Disney bought 51 acres of land for a new studio in Burbank, California. In 1940, everyone moved into the complex. The studio was now a big business. There were hundreds of employees. The animators worked in one building, and inkers, painters, and special effects artists worked in others. Walt thought that his employees would be happy to leave their old cramped spaces to work in a modern, air-conditioned buildings, but he was wrong. In the old days, all Disney employees worked closely together and felt like family. Now, they were separated from each other. People rarely saw Walt. There were complaints that the studio felt like a big factory. On top of that, once again, the studio was having money trouble. A lot of money came from selling Disney cartoons to theaters in countries all over Europe, but since 1939, World War II had been raging in Europe. The market for Disney films there dried up, so Roy had to cut wages, and this made employees angry. They said that they would stop working if Walt and Roy didn't listen to their complaints. Walt held a meeting and tried to calm people down. It didn't work. On May 29 of 1941, hundreds of Disney workers went on strike. That meant they refused to work until their demands were met. They stood outside the studio entrance shouting at anyone who dared to go to work. When Walt drove up each morning, workers screamed and banged on his car. The strike lasted 9 weeks. It upset Walt terribly. He believed that the Disney studio had always been fair to employees. He felt betrayed. His health suffered again from all the stress. In early August, he went to South America. While he was away, Roy settled with the strike leader. The employees got their pay demands. But the strike changed Walt. He refused to see that any of the workers had honest complaints. He was very bitter. Then in September, his father Elias died. Now both Walt's parents were gone. And his next full-length cartoon, Dumbo, about a flying elephant, was not the success Walt was hoping for. It came out in October of 1941. Everything changed at the studio after December 7th of 1941. That was when the Japanese army bombed an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now the United States was in War II. American soldiers were fighting on 2 fronts, in the Pacific and in Europe. The U.S. Army took over Walt's studio, training films for soldiers that were needed. Walt had a hard time feeling creative doing this kind of work. Walt used Donald Duck in several cartoons for the U.S. Army. In one, Donald Duck plays a skinny American soldier who becomes a hero. In another film, Donald Duck is living a miserable life in the Nazi Germany. At the end, it turns out to be a bad dream. Donald wakes up safe and happy in the United States. This kind of film make Americans feel proud of their country. At the end of the war ended in 1945, Walt could now go back to making his own movies. Several live-action adventure movies came out, but audiences didn't like Treasure Island, Swiss Family Robinson, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as much as they liked Snow White. One Disney movie, Song of the South, made many people angry. The main character is an old African-American man named Uncle Remus who lived in the Southern Plantation. The NAACP, an early civil rights organization, felt the movie made the lives of slaves seem happy. Even though the film was set after the Civil War had ended, Black Americans were very upset. Critics say Walt Disney was out of touch. Walt turned to making nature movies like Seal Island, stories that filmed real animals but had made up stories. Walt did not pour his heart into these films the way that he had with his classics. Maybe making movies was starting to bore him a little, or maybe it was because Walt had already been thinking of the next big thing. Chapter 10, A Fantasy World. In some ways, Walt Disney remained a kid at heart. When he took his daughter to the merry-go-round at the Griffith Park, he'd get on a horse and ride too. At home, Walt spent hours tinkering with wind-up toys and model trains. He even had a real little railroad built in his big backyard. On weekends, Walt put on an engineer cap. He'd take his daughters and friends for a ride. Afterwards, he'd whip up goopy banana splits that nobody could finish. It was good, wholesome fun. That started Walt thinking, what if there were a place where families, not just kids, could go and have fun together? It would be like an amusement park, only cleaner, different, better. It would have a village like Marceline, Missouri. Stores would sell Disney clothes and toys. There'd be little railroads, a movie theater, and rides. Lots of rides. Roy wasn't wild about Disneyland idea. Who will pay for it, he asked, but Walt already had the answer. Television had always fascinated Walt. He saw that it was the next big thing. Although the 1920s and 30s people turned into popular radio shows, but you could only listen to the radio. You couldn't see anything. Television brought about the end of the radio shows. Many filmmakers also thought of TV as the enemy. The little screen was taking away the audience for big screen pictures. Not Walt. He saw TV as another way to entertain people. He thought that in return for Disney TV show, a network would invest in his theme park. Walt was right. ABC started running a show that featured Disney cartoons and some live-action skits. It was a big hit. The only show that was more popular than I Love Lucy, starring a comedian, Lucille Ball. Walt was the host of the show. He talked to viewers in a friendly, grandfatherly way. Before long, kids all knew Walt Disney's face. He was a star. The Mickey Mouse Club was another hit for ABC. In every episode, there was always a newsreel, a cartoon, a song, and dances performed by the group of young actors called the Mouseketeers. The show first aired in 1955. For many years, it ran 5 days a week. He also created a Western mini-series called Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett was a real-life frontiersman from Tennessee who lived in the early 1800s. To play Davy, Walt chose a good-looking young actor named Fess Parker. There were only 3 episodes of Davy Crockett, but every kid wanted a coonskin cap like Davy's. Every kid knew the words to the theme song. The studio made a lot of money in television. Television helped Walt build his Disneyland dream. As with all of the other big Disney projects, Walt was in control. He loved working on the theme park. If he wanted to create a jungle, he did. If a lake wasn't big enough, he had it made bigger. Disneyland opened on July 17th of 1955 in Anaheim, California. Just 4 days earlier, he and Lillian had their 13th wedding anniversary. Opening day did not go smoothly. Crowds stood in line in 100-degree heat. Some of the rides weren't working. The train didn't lead anywhere. It came to a dead end. There were not enough trash cans or water fountains, but Walt had things fixed right away. Soon, the place was spotless. Everyone who worked there was polite and cheerful. They had to go to Disney University to learn exactly how to behave towards visitors. People all over the world were flocking to Disneyland. They could spend time in Fantasyland with its fairy tale castle and fairy tale characters and costumes. They could look for hippos and other wild animals in Adventureland, or ride on the Mark Twain riverboat. There was Main Street that looked very much like the one in Marceline, Missouri. Walt enjoyed Disneyland as much as anyone, but he had to disguise himself in a floppy hat and sunglasses, or else fans would mob him. Sometimes a child would still recognize him. Walt would put his fingers to his lips and secretly slip the child an autograph. After hours, Walt had Disneyland all to himself. He drove a mini fire engine through the streets or relaxed in his private apartment over the firehouse on Main Street. Already, he was thinking about the next big thing, a city of the future. Walt's plan for Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow, included monorails and underground roads to keep children safe from cars. City streets would be designed to look like different places from around the world. It would be just the kind of place Walt would want to visit himself. Chapter 11, Final Act. Some men slow down as they age, but not Walt Disney. He had too many ideas to quit working. In 1964, a giant World's Fair was held outside of New York City. Some of the best exhibits were designed by Walt Disney. One was called The Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. An Abraham Lincoln robot got up from a chair. He looked left and right at his audience. Then he shifted his weight from one foot to another and recited a speech about liberty. The robot looked so real that people thought it was an actor. Walt didn't spend much time in the studio anymore. Making movies didn't interest him. Diane and Sharon were both married. Walt and Lillian became regular babysitters for their grandchildren. Walt loved having a full house of little children again. He often sat on his lawn and watched his wild bunch pile up patio furniture to make backyard forts and rocket ships. He let the kids spend the night at Disneyland and explore it when nobody else was around. And he put some of them into Disney films, just for fun. In July 1966, Walt and Lillian celebrated their 41st anniversary. They took the whole family on a cruise to the British Columbia. Walt wasn't feeling well, but he enjoyed being with his grandchildren. He let them crawl all over him. When he got tired, he climbed up to the upper deck to think. He'd think about Epcot. After the trip, Walt didn't get better. Medical tests discovered something very serious. Walt had lung cancer. Walt had smoked cigarettes since his days in France. Until 1964, however, people did not know that smoking caused cancer. While Walt was in the hospital, Roy came for a visit. He found Walt staring at the ceiling. Walt pointed out where everything was going to go at Epcot. The next day, December 15th of 1966, he died. Walt Disney was 65 years old. He did not live to see the opening of Walt Disney World in Florida in 1971, but Roy was there. He waited to retire until Walt Disney World was completed. Walt Disney had been gone for a long time. However, he is still entertaining people through Disney books, records, movies, toys, and his parks all over the world, where each year millions of families come with one idea: to have fun. And that is the end of our story. There are some timelines of Walt's, it says timeline of the world and timeline of Walt Disney's life. There is some of the information where they got the author of this book Whitney Stewart, where she got her information. And then here is a list of some of the famous movies made by Walt Disney. So I really hope you enjoyed this book. It had a lot of really good information about Walt Disney that I didn't know. So I always think it's interesting to learn more about a man who really makes awesome things, or the man who started Disney. Thanks for listening.